Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Tschirgi. I'm here to talk to you about adoption as a family planning option. So thank you for joining me. Okay, and so just a little bit of background about me. So I'm a genetic counselor with Quest Diagnostics. I have over 10 years of foster parenting experience in a couple of different states, and I'm the adoptive parent of 6 children, 4 of whom are biologically related to each other. And I have personal experience with adopting through many different means. The only means of adoption that I don't have personal experience with is international adoption, although I will be covering that in today's talk. As far as disclosures go, I am married to the author of Stretch Mark My Heart, which is our adoption story, and some of the content in this presentation comes from that book. So I'm going to review the different processes for adoption in the United States, and then also talk about adoption first vocabulary. And so it's important to know that, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based off my own personal experience. Not everything I talk about is going to apply to every situation. It's not meant to be all encompassing, but hopefully this will give you a nice review as to what adoption is. So I always find it interesting to see how adoption is portrayed in the media. So over here on the left, we have little Luke Skywalker being adopted by Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, and then his sister, Princess Leia, is being adopted by Senator Organa and his family. They were separated at birth, and that's what the Star Wars movies are about. I'm a big sci-fi fan. As far as Elf, it's one of my favorite Christmas movies. This is about somebody who's adopted by North Pole elves. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we have Thor and Loki. They are brothers. Loki is adopted. I find it interesting that the adopted brother is the one who's kind of a double crosser, and you don't know if he's on your side or not. And then the last one here is Instant Family. So if you were to watch a movie about adoption and foster care, I would highly recommend Instant Family. It's portrayed in a very realistic way. It's got really high caliber actors. This is Mark Wahlberg. I couldn't believe how realistic it was. It was almost like they were reading my mail. So again, not 100% accurate because it is Hollywood, but I would say the most accurate movie regarding adoption and foster care. So highly recommend. So adoption is the legal process of becoming a parent to a child where there's typically not a blood relationship. So I know, of course, there's going to be exceptions to this rule where maybe somebody adopts a grandchild or a niece or a nephew, but usually there's not a blood relationship there. And in the United States, there's lots of different ways to do this. And it can be very lengthy and emotional on both sides, whether it's the adoptive family side or the birth family side. Why would somebody want to pursue this? So if somebody is a carrier of a known inherited condition, adoption prevents that genetic risk from being passed on to the next generation. However, there's 2 sides to that coin. There might be new unknown hereditary risks with the birth family. And it's a very personal experience. So people start the journey when they feel ready, and I say that in quotes. It's really different for everybody. Some people do all the research they can. Some people do the research as they are on the journey. And again, it's very personal for everybody. So adopting through an agency. So adoption agencies are organizations that facilitate the adoption process, and the adoptive family needs to complete a home study. So without a home study, a child cannot be placed. So, and it's a very all-encompassing and very detailed. So they ask you questions about finances, parenting, your upbringing, mental and medical family history, religious beliefs. Your home is inspected for safety. You have to take a CPR class and first aid classes. So this can take a few months to be approved. And there might be deficiencies that need to go back and be remediated. So this is really needs to happen without a home study. Typically, the adoptive family cannot receive a child into their home for adoption. Also, for us, we created an adoption portfolio. So this is like a scrapbook. I'm sure they're digital, but back in the day, they weren't digital. It was physical. So we created a scrapbook with quotes and just how my wife and I met. And it's really the birth family's first introduction to, who we're going to place our child with. the birth family and the adoptive family get counseling and support through the agency. However, they can be referred out to services, especially if they require something that's a little more intense or lengthy than what the agency can supply. And then, of course, there are costs associated with adopting through a private agency. I wanted to touch on open adoption. So this is becoming more common. We have different open relationships with different birth families for our children. And it's all about the safety, what's in the best interest of the child. It's shared relationship, not shared roles. So our kids have never been confused like who their parents are. They always understand that my wife and I are their parents, and then they have birth family as well. And it's a legal agreement. So it might be, we're going to do a visit in person every 6 months, or we're going to do a letter once a year. I know nowadays there might be social media clauses where they set up a private social media page and they're able to share pictures. And so that's a safe place where people can share information. Back in the day, there wasn't any social media for us, so this wasn't a part of our agreements. You can also adopt through foster care. So it's important to know that the purpose of foster care is reunification, not adoption. So if somebody gets into foster care like, oh, I want to adopt these children, you have to understand that the foster care system has a different goal than what an adoptive family does. So children are typically placed into foster care temporarily, and it should be temporarily because of trauma, abuse, and neglect. Usually the parents must go through a series of court-appointed tests in order to receive their children back. And it's not a one or done thing. It's like, oh, well, you have to do this. And then if you don't meet this one deadline, that's it. They're typically given many chances to do these things. However, some parents are not able to do that for a number of different reasons. So then the state seeks adoptive placement. They will look to relatives first, usually. But then if there's no relatives available, then they will look to licensed foster parents for adoptive placement. And so adopting through the foster care, it's similar to through an agency. So you have to go through classes, you have to go through trainings, you have to do CPR, and there's a home study. So when we did this, we had a home study for our agency, then we had a home study for foster care. Those two didn't talk to each other. They were completely separate processes that we had to do. And then if you're going to be a foster parent, you have to do continuing education to maintain that. And foster parents can indicate the types of children they prefer for placement. So a lot of times this is for safety. So they're like, okay, we have an infant or a toddler at home. We don't want older children where there might be a safety issue. Or we have older children, we would prefer younger children. And so Child Protective Services has the task of placing children with families. There's always way more children in care than families, and CPS might push the boundaries. So for example, a family might be licensed for 2 children ages 0 to 10. Like, oh, we've got a sibling group of 3 and one of them is 12. We'll sign a waiver so we can place them. And so there might be some boundary pushing, and it's really important that foster parents understand what their boundaries are and stick to those boundaries if needed. And there's a lot of uncertainties regarding placement. So we got a call on a 6 and an 8-year-old where, oh yeah, they're going to be adopted. They ended up going back to their birth family and were never adopted. And then we got a call for a 16-month-old and they said, okay, you'll have them for 3 months. He's 15 and we adopted him. So you just never know how things are going to shake out. And the cost of adoption is subsidized by the state. So if you're comparing agency versus through the state, the cost is much, much less. And then there's foster to adopt. So these are children who have been in the system maybe for some time, and parental rights are relinquished or already in process. So these children are not being placed temporarily. It's we need to find these children a home. So sometimes there is a placement for the intention to adopt on the front end. And then you can adopt through an attorney. So in the United States, you always use an attorney. That has to happen for it to be legal. But however, people can go just through an attorney and they can skip all of these organizations. So like, for example, I know I was living in a small college town. There's a college student who became pregnant, wanted to place her child for adoption, and she just found a family and they negotiated on their own. They used an attorney. They didn't use any of these organizations. So again, no social services because it's an organization, although the attorney might have some resources to refer out to. And again, of course, there's going to be attorney fees, but there's going to be attorney fees regardless of what kind of adoption is done. Then there's international adoption. So as I said, I've never done this personally. This was a lot popular in the 90s and early 2000s, and especially with COVID, I don't know how much this is happening now, but there's something called the Hague Convention, which is a set of guidelines used to prevent trafficking and kidnapping. And so any international adoption has to follow those guidelines. The adoptive parents apply for citizenship on behalf of the child. You work through the State Department. So it's very lengthy. So not only do you have, an organization you're working with, you're also working with the government. And so it can take quite some time for international adoption. And then depending on what country, you can have additional trainings about culture, language. They might fly over to that country, maybe 1, 2, 3 times, even before they get that child. And then once they get the child, there's usually medical exams, immunizations, and that child does become a citizen through the adoption process. And of course, there are fees associated with this type of adoption. So it's really important to use correct terminology. So as an adoptive parent, I am an educator for life. I'm always going to be educating people about adoption. These are all questions that I have answered or people have asked me. Do you have any real children? Yes, I have 6 real children. None of them are fake. What is the real mom story? Well, my wife is the real mom. I mean, are you talking about the birth mom? That's a little bit of an invasive question. Isn't foster care like babysitting? No, it is not. Children in foster care are usually victims of abuse, neglect, and trauma. It takes specialized training to care for those children because you just can't, it's not like babysitting at all. Do you have any children of your own? Yes, I have 6 children of my own. Why are the children in foster care? Well, that's a little bit, again, of an invasive question, and every kid has their own story, and we're going to let them tell that story. Are you going to keep him or her? They're not pets. And a lot of times foster parents may not have a say as far as if they're going to keep those children or not. Is he or she a drug baby? Again, that's a bit of an invasive question. And this will be such good practice when you have real kids, and apparently I've been practicing for over 18 years now. And then terminology. So this is really important. So again, I've had people say things on the left to me, and it's really important to use types of terminology that's on the right. So, instead of using the terms real children, let's maybe use the term biological or birth children or parents or siblings. Own child, you have any children of your own versus biological child. In the adoption community, somebody might say, oh yeah, I've got 4 kids, 3 are adopted, 1's bio. That's quite common terminology to use. Given up for adoption, that has a big negative connotation on it. That places like, oh, maybe it was the child's fault that they were placed for adoption. But if you can use a word placed for adoption, that means so much more. That has much more of a positive connotation to it. I know that just in me, my day-to-day, when I hear people use the word placed for adoption and they're not in the adoption community, that really means a lot to me. So foster child, I'll admit, I've probably used that term many times, but it's really about child in foster care. There are, that child's identity is more than being in foster care. So it's really important to use person first language. And then avoiding the word foreign, whether it's foreign child or foreign adoption, again, that's very exclusive. We want to talk about, where is that child from, or maybe using the word international adoption. So some things to consider. It's very lengthy, emotional, and uncertain, and the timing is extremely variable. So for our first child, we submitted the paperwork, took about 1.5 years to actually, get him in our home. Our second child, we submitted the paperwork and we got a call in 3 days. So with a pregnancy, you've got 9 months. You have a clock that's ticking. There's no clock when it comes to adoption. And that's very hard for people, but that needs to be accepted. For people watching this, if somebody wants to pursue adoption, if you don't take anything away from this talk, I would say the 3rd bullet point on this slide is the most important. So have an adoption attorney who specializes in adoption law. I know many of us have seen, stories sensationalized in the media about adoptions that have kind of gone sideways. Typically, the reason for that is the adoption attorney didn't understand what was happening in the situation and didn't understand the laws. So, it's like picking your OBGYN. You wouldn't have a podiatrist deliver your baby. That works on an airplane in an emergency, but it doesn't set somebody up for success. So use an adoption attorney who understands adoption law, don't get, oh, my cousin does real estate law, I'm going to use them. No, that is not setting somebody up for success. So definitely use an attorney who specializes in adoption law. The costs are extremely variable. Fortunately, there are financial resources, even like tax credits, or even some employers might have some money earmarked for adoption or maybe parental leave. So there are some resources available for people. So if somebody wanted to pursue adoption, I would say reach out locally. Usually most people might have friends or family who have adopted. You know, you invite them out for coffee or go to dinner with them and pick their brain. Just ask them about their experience and then contact local organizations. I wouldn't just Google adoption. You can go down a lot of rabbit trails. And so I would recommend start with people start local. And then if you're not getting the information you want, you can expand out from there. So here are some resources. The tax credit changes, seems like every year. I don't know what it's at since it's been so long since we've adopted. There's crowdfunding websites. I think most people have heard of GoFundMe. So that might be an option for raising funds to support somebody's adoption. And then here are some reputable websites regarding different kinds of adoption. Here are my references. And like I said, I'm an educator for life, happy to connect, whether it's via email or different social media platforms. I'm always happy to connect with others and to talk about adoption. And I thank you so much for your time and your attention during this presentation.